Hi everybody, this is Laura, City Scrapper. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I have a layout that I made using the August My Creative Scrapbook Limited Edition kit. In the August kit, there are papers and embellishments from the Prima Avec Amour collection, and I was struck by how very fancy these papers were, and so I thought I would try to mirror that with the composition of my layout. And I really love to include rosettes on my pages, so I decided that I would make a number of those for this layout. I cut a number of strips of paper that measure 1¼ inches. I used a scoring board and I scored them at each 1/4 inch. Now I am folding the paper back and forth in an accordion style so that I can form my rosettes. The next step in making a rosette is to glue the two sides of the strip of paper together. I always try to overlap them a bit. That helps the rosette from not popping apart. And I find that this is one of the few times when I make scrapbook pages that I must use a hot glue gun because the speed at which the hot glue dries comes in really handy for making rosettes. I think this next part is kind of tricky. I flatten out the rosette and hold it down while applying some hot glue to a circle that I punched out earlier, and then I press that circle of cardstock against the rosette and press it down until it's dry. This is sped up, so of course it takes a little bit longer than this to dry. The hot glue gun dries very quickly, and that really comes in handy. I put a little bit of extra glue between the round piece of cardstock and the pattern paper, just to make sure that none of the individual folds pop up later on, which has happened to me in the past, so I do try to make sure I put enough glue. I also put a little bit of glue in the center of the rosette, again, just for some added strength to the rosette. I went ahead and I made 4 rosettes. I'm going to cut each of them in half. I used some sharp scissors to do that. And now I'm adding half of a punched out scalloped circle made from pattern paper to each of the rosettes. I put the rosettes aside for a little while and begin working on the rest of my page. My page concept changed quite a bit. At first I was going to use this cut file. I ended up going in a totally different direction and use this cut file on a different layout, but you could still see how the composition is developing here. I cut a large strip of paper for the center that is a really pretty blue pattern paper, and then I used a pink pattern paper for strips for the top and the bottom of the layout, and I am attaching everything down to a piece of pattern paper that I have in my stash that I know I won't use. This just helps me to be able to conserve paper. I don't mind using up paper, but I certainly don't want to waste it. I'm going to have my rosettes in 2 lines, one below the blue paper, one on top of the blue paper. So I place those down on the layout. Since the rosettes have a little bit of dimension, I'm going to pop up that center pattern paper area so that they will fit underneath the blue pattern paper. Before I attach the blue paper down to the layout, I add a border strip on both sides. I used a Martha Stewart border punch that I had in my stash, and I cut some borders out of some lightweight white cardstock. Since I'm going to be popping this portion up off of the background, I'm using a piece of very lightweight cardboard that will help the pattern paper not to sag later on when I put the strips of adhesive behind it. I use some ATG adhesive on the cardboard, and then I attach my piece of blue pattern paper down. There's no cardboard behind the border strip because you could see through that border strip, and I definitely didn't want you to be able to see cardboard on the layout. I put ATG adhesive down on the cardboard, but then I remembered I wanted to pop it up using some foam. Here I'm using a Spiegel Mom Scraps Big Mama roll of foam. This really is quite a large roll of adhesive. I have had it for a long time, and this gave the cardboard and the pattern paper just enough dimension that I'll be able to tuck the rosettes behind it. I remove the backing from the adhesive. I have my T-square on my layout. I want to make sure that this blue paper is straight. The foam adheres very well to whatever surface you put it on, so I didn't want to have to peel that back up again. Now I'm tucking my rosettes underneath the border strip. The 4 rosettes didn't fit perfectly going across the page, so I just kind of push them together a little bit, there's a little bit of overhang on each edge, and I'll end up trimming that off. At this point, I'm still going with the cut file. I put some ATG adhesive on the back of it and attach it down to the layout. Once I have the cut file positioned, I begin working on some borders for the very top of the layout and the very bottom. Using that same Martha Stewart border punch that I used earlier, I cut out a border in white. I'm going to have one at the top and one at the bottom. On top of that white strip, I attach down a small strip of blue pattern paper, and then I cut the excess white paper away by hand. I sometimes have trouble cutting thinner strips on my trimmer. Sometimes they end up getting crooked if they're very thin strips, so I thought it would just be easier to use a pair of scissors. And then I attach that border strip down to the bottom, and then I do the exact same thing for the top. At this point, I decided that I wasn't going to use the cut file, so I removed that from the background. I'm going to use some of the frames that were in the ephemera pack that came in this month's kit. So to make the area where the frames are going to go a little bit smaller, I'm adding another piece of pattern paper, and I'm going to layer that on top of what I have there. The only thing is I want to remove that center piece of pattern paper because I want to use it for another layout. Normally I would not attempt this. I would just have to accept the fact that there's going to be a big chunk of paper that gets covered up. But because I attached the pattern paper down to cardboard, I knew that the pattern paper would peel up relatively easily. I drew lines with a pencil, and then I used a craft knife and a metal ruler. I scored along those pencil lines several times, pressing a little tiny bit harder each time, and then I was able to save that piece of blue pattern paper, which was a good thing because I ended up using it on another layout. This month I was a little heavy-handed with the pattern paper. I used a lot of pattern paper on each layout. Do you find with Prima pattern papers the patterns can be combined more so than other manufacturers? That's just my point of view, but I don't feel like I'm overdoing it when I combine a lot of pattern papers on the same layout using Prima papers. So I added more border strips to that center piece of pattern paper, which I think is so pretty with all of those roses on it. Next, I cut some extremely thin strips of white cardstock, and I placed them on the 4 borders that I have on the layout right now. I was thinking that that would add a nice finished edge to them. Now I'm placing down those frames that were in the kit. I have 3 of them. I put the large one in the center and then 2 smaller ones on either side. And now I'm attaching down all of those strips. I just add a little bit of the ATG adhesive to each of them and press them down. You could see that on this layout, many times I use my T-square. When making a layout like this, I think it's so important that everything is straight. So I did recheck all of these lines to make sure they were straight many times. Now I'm going to add a white border to each of the frames. I use some ATG adhesive, attach them down to some white cardstock, and then I begin fussy cutting around them, cutting just a little white border. This will help the frames contrast with the pattern paper behind it. I did this for all 3 frames, and I'm using some smaller scissors. I think that having a good pair of fussy cutting scissors is so important. Otherwise, I think that this is so much harder to do. Scissors really make a difference when fussy cutting. I have my 3 frames in the center. I added a piece of chipboard that was in the kit to the top center, and now I'm popping up all of those 3 frames on some foam. At this point, I wasn't sure which photos I was using. Unfortunately, my Canon selfie ran out of paper and I didn't have any, and I ordered some, but it hadn't arrived yet. So I wasn't sure where I was going to find such small pictures because I usually have my photos printed in 4x6. And when I want smaller photos, which I often do, I print them myself. Luckily, I was able to find some photos from a page that I started and abandoned, which I very rarely do. And I was able to use those photos on this layout. They worked out perfectly, but I was a little worried for a while. I removed that piece of chipboard that I had on the top and I replaced it with this piece of chipboard that says Cherished Moments. I thought it would be perfect to use as a title. And then I added some die cuts. These have some white flowers on them. I like the idea of using white flowers since the layout is so busy already. The layout being busy did not stop me from adding more embellishments. I added a butterfly on the left. Now I'm adding one on the right. Then I was thinking that since I had a thin strip of white paper along the punched out border of all the other borders on the page, it made sense to add one on the top and on the bottom. It's such a little detail to add this strip, but to me it makes a difference in the overall look of the layout. I used my scissors, I trimmed a little bit of one of the strips off of the right, and now here are my photos. I had taken these photos at a museum in New York City, and then I wanted to use these wooden frames that I had, and I tried putting these into the frames. That just didn't work out. The frames were very festive. I think they had pom-poms on them, and these pictures are in a kind of elegant setting, so I thought that they were perfect. I just happened to have 3 of them. I did have to cut them down a bit. I used a corner rounder. I rounded the edges and I mounted them on some white cardstock. So instead of cutting out the inside of the frame, I just placed the pictures right on top. I discovered there were some tiny blue flower die cuts, so I decided to add those and layer them on top of the white flowers. You could still see some of the white flowers, but I like the little touch of blue there as well. I love when we get chipboard in the kits. We got a beautiful set of chipboard. I cut it into smaller pieces for this layout, and then I embossed it. I first coated it with gesso, and then I covered it with some white embossing powder and then with some sparkly embossing powder. And I actually made this for another layout. I decided to use other pieces of chipboard on that layout, so I thought that it went perfectly over the title of this layout. And now I'm adding some pearls to it just to add a little bit of extra embellishment to the chipboard piece. While these are self-adhesive pearls, they won't stay attached to an embossed piece of chipboard. So I place them on the chipboard, but then I'm going to reinforce them with some glossy accents adhesive so that they'll still be there a few months later when I have them in my scrapbook. Otherwise, they will fall off really quickly. I also add some really tiny pearls to the centers of these little blue flowers. I always keep some tiny self-adhesive pearls on hand because I love using them to embellish and draw extra attention to certain areas on my layouts. I was thinking that since I have a number of pearls around the page, I didn't want to leave the photo frames unembellished, especially since there were a couple of places on the frames that were really calling out for a pearl. So I started off with the center frame, and then I ended up adding pearls to all the frames. Not a ton, but just enough to add a little bit of something to them. After I added the pearls to the picture frames, I was thinking that the layout was done, but then when I was all done with creating all my layouts for the month, I had a piece of chipboard left, and I was thinking it would look great to balance out the piece of chipboard at the top. So I used the same steps to emboss this piece that I did the one at the top. I used some glossy accents to hold it in place, and then I added some more pearls to this piece of chipboard. For the picture frames and the flowers on either side, I used a very small 3mm pearl. For the chipboard pieces, I'm using slightly larger pearls, and I vary the size of them. Some are a little bit larger, some are a little bit smaller. It just depends on what spot I'm putting the pearl on the chipboard. That was the very last touch. The layout is complete, and here are some close-ups. Thank you so much for watching this video, everyone. I'm so grateful for everybody's views and likes and comments. Thank you so much. Please check out the My Creative Scrapbook website. The link to their website is in the description box. Also, check out their social media. They have lots of great layouts for inspiration. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll see you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.